the Founding Fathers was generally deistic. They believed there was a God, but they didn't necessarily support any one particular religion.
This is why, as the novel depicts, their intent eventually took shape as one of our basic American principles, the separation of church and state. What is also mentioned in the book is that the Masons' quest to build a new enlightened society was no simple task. Other groups, such as the Knights Templar and the Rosicrucians, had similar ideas, but they were crushed by the powerful church groups. The book also describes how for centuries in Europe, powerfully connected church leaders claimed to speak for God and demanded allegiance to their beliefs and tenets. Advanced scientific thinkers such as Isaac Newton and Leonardo da Vinci were forced to conceal much of their work or be labeled as heretics. That's true.
Anyone who discussed various theories in the sciences as to what was going on outside of our planet more than lost their lives. Some of them were burned at the stake.
The novel is also right when it describes the Masons rejecting religious dogma. All one had to do was believe in a higher power, not in any specific God.
Freemasonry's purpose is to encourage a man in his faith, but not encourage that man to impose his faith on others.
What they're basically saying here, and this is what the fundamentalists hate, that they're all different roads to the same thing.
That threat became a reality with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But by declaring their independence, these men risked everything for a new concept called freedom. This time, the dream became a reality, and in 1787, many of the basic Masonic tenets became integral parts of the United States Constitution. Brown writes that half the signers of the Constitution were Masons. Masonic estimates, however, put that number closer to 1/3. The lost symbol connects the Masons' role in the founding of the American dream. But what we don't learn is that this Masonic influence has had a profound effect beyond politics. Baseball owner Branch Rickey signed the first African-American Major League Baseball player, Jackie Robinson. Literary icon Mark Twain introduced us to Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. And John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Unfortunately, the Masons have also had their share of black sheep, including the traitor Benedict Arnold, controversial FBI director J. Edgar Hoover, and even the ruthless communist dictator Joseph Stalin was rumored to be a Mason. Their connection to the halls of power caused many to wonder if the Masons really do have sinister secrets. The fact Masons sought a higher calling and belief system did nothing to stop their enemies. The battle between light and dark was about to begin. The villain in The Lost Symbol targets the Masons, which include some of the most powerful men in the country. Is it really possible to take down such a powerful society? The secrecy associated with Masonry fueled suspicion and fear among outsiders since the founding of the country.
Freemasons are thought to have some kind of influence over their members that transcends a member's obligation to his family or to the state, so that Freemasons are this shadowy, subversive group that's doing something bad.
But it wasn't always that way. In the wake of the American Revolution, enrollment in the Masons skyrocketed.
The fact that Washington made it such an important part of his life, and that he did things like lay the cornerstone of the Capitol building as a Freemason, really brought a lot of important attention to Freemasonry, which made it a very popular thing to do.
Their popularity, however, presented a threat to religious leaders wary of the Masonic deistic beliefs. In the book, Dan Brown writes about how people developed a warped perception of the Masons. That's true. Over time, a drumbeat of accusations stoked the fears of many non-Masons who wondered what really went on inside the Masonic temples. The book's villain is driven by suspicions like these.
Anything that's secret creates suspicion, especially in a republic where we're arguing that everyone's equal, and we've always, as Americans, believed in a certain degree of transparency. And so there were a lot of suspicions about the Masons.
What the book didn't include is that these suspicions exploded in 1826 with the disappearance of a well-known disgruntled Mason named William Morgan.
this is one of those places where Dan Brown was using a historical incident as an inspiration for something in the current world.
When Morgan announced he was writing a book exposing Masonic secrets, several Masons allegedly staged a kidnapping.
He disappeared. He was supposedly murdered, most likely. Nobody's ever heard of him again.
Eventually, 3 Masons were convicted but received minimal sentences.
There was what amounted to close to a national panic of anti-Masonry. Lodges were burned, Masons were ridiculed, some even beaten in the street, and Masonic membership dropped in some places close to zero.
In the 1830s, the Anti-Masonic Party was formed and nominated a former U.S. Attorney General, William Wirt. Wirt ran against Freemason Andrew Jackson and lost. He soon became a footnote in history. But more than a century and a half later, William Wirt made headlines once again.
Somebody broke into William Wirt's crypt, chopped off his head, and took his skull.
The theft remained undetected for almost 30 years, until an anonymous caller claimed to be in possession of the skull.
Then the anonymous caller hung up and we didn't hear about it again for a year. The next phone call we got in regard to William Wirt was from City Councilman Jim Graham here in Washington, D.C., who informed us that the skull had been placed in his possession to assure its rightful disposition wherever it belonged.
It was never known why Wirt's skull was stolen. Perhaps it was used in strange rituals. Perhaps it was just a college prank. William Wirt was a symbol of the anti-Masonic sentiment that would continue to plague the secret society. But during this time, a new Masonic group rose to power, the Scottish Rite, the same group featured in Dan Brown's The Lost Symbol. According to some, they had a dark side, fueling deep suspicions. Suspicions at the heart of the novel. The Lost Symbol opens its first scene here, the Masonic House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. The novel describes this massive structure as a replica of the temple of Greek king Mausolus, the original mausoleum. The book also claims that it is a mausoleum, holding the remains of 2 of its Masonic leaders. In fact, that's true. The story depicts the building as featuring 2 17-ton sphinxes, massive 33-foot columns, and a huge bronze door. The novel also claims a large skylight exists right above the temple's huge altar. In reality, these descriptions are accurate. This is the home of the largest and most powerful Masonic group in the country, the Southern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. In The Lost Symbol, Professor Langdon comes face to face with this statue of Albert Pike, a man many consider the most famous person you've never heard of.
Albert Pike is probably one of the least known but yet influential men of letters and writings that this country has ever known. Albert Pike was the Howard Stern, the shock jock of the Freemasonry.
Albert Pike is probably one of the most misunderstood Freemasons in the world. He has been vilified, many, many times vilified, by individuals who are fundamentalists.
What the novel doesn't mention is that Albert Pike is one of the men buried inside the temple. But why? Why would the Masons place the body of someone so vilified inside their temple?
He certainly is a dark figure. I tend to refer to him as a dark Francis Bacon. He was an enormous man. He stood over 6 feet tall. He weighed over 200 pounds. He was a brilliant mathematician, linguist, jurist, orator, poet. And he set out